Hi everyone, I'm Casey. Today, I want to tell you the story of Elizabeth Ellis, a mother who faced death in the heart of a New York subway station, only to wake up amidst the soul-piercing sound of a train whistle. Walk with me into the heart of this resilient woman to see that sometimes the bitterest truth is the strongest medicine. The train whistle is still echoing in my ears, sharp and nagging, like a needle piercing my eardrum. I am sitting here in my spacious bedroom in Manhattan, surrounded by the heavy, expensive furniture that reflects the prestige of the Ellis Healthcare Group. But the air feels as cold as a tomb. I just returned from that accident, the near-death experience that Vanessa dismissed as a simple mishap caused by me being senile. She thinks I am dead, or, at the very least, that I have lost my mind. But as I look down at the Cartier watch on my wrist, the second hand keeps ticking away, cruel and steady. It reminds me that I am 62 years old. 62 years on this earth, and I have never found time to be this terrifying. The house is so quiet that I can actually hear the frantic thumping of my own heart. I pour myself a cup of black coffee, no sugar, the same bitter taste I have relied on every time I had to face a crisis at the corporation. But this time, the opponent is not some rival pharmaceutical firm. It is the two children sleeping soundly in the next room, Vanessa and David. I look at the family photo on my vanity. For 15 years, ever since David graduated from college, I have spent every waking moment paving the way for him. I brought him onto the board of directors and welcomed Vanessa into this home as if she were my own flesh and blood. Now, looking back, I see myself as a fool who used her best years to raise a pack of wolves. "You are old, Mom. You need to rest," Vanessa had said, right before she shoved me toward the tracks. Those words were like a dagger, tearing through the last of my illusions about family. I touched the dark bruise on my arm, the physical evidence of a heartless betrayal. The peak 65 wave is coming, and Ellis Healthcare is standing on the brink of a massive opportunity in 2025. But I am standing at the edge of a hollow abyss. How much time did I waste protecting David from the truth that his wife is a greedy predator? How many years did I lose building an empire for heirs who only wish to see me 6 feet under? A sudden phone call breaks the silence. It is Gerald, my lawyer. His voice is thick with worry, asking if I am all right because he saw the news. I look into the mirror and see an African-American woman whose eyes are no longer soft or weak. The era of useless sacrifice is over. I find myself wondering exactly how much time I have left to take back the justice that belongs to me. The Manhattan streetlights cast long, pale streaks across the oak floor of my study, cutting through the stillness of the room. I do not turn on the lights because I need this darkness to face the files the detective just sent over. Before I can even touch them, my hand brushes against the bottom drawer of my desk, the place where I keep a velvet-lined wooden box containing my real fortune. It is not filled with stocks or certificates, but with the broken fragments of a mother who spent her entire life lying to herself. I open the box and find a photo of David when he was 5 years old, grinning brightly next to a spaceship-shaped birthday cake. Back then, I was newly divorced and struggling with 3 different jobs just to keep us afloat. For 30 years, I repeated the same pattern, working like a machine, so David could have the very best of everything. 15 years ago, I was spending $80,000 a year on his private school tuition, while I walked around in the same pair of worn-out Skechers until the soles were thin. I even walked away from a chance at remarriage with a decent man because I was terrified David would feel abandoned. I built the Ellis Healthcare Group as a fortress to protect him. But I realize now that I forgot to teach him how to stand on his own 2 feet. My overprotection created a weak man, someone who could stand by and watch his wife try to kill his own mother without saying a single word. I begin flipping through the bank statements I secretly pulled last night. There it is, Med Supply Solutions. It sounds professional, but it is nothing more than an empty shell. More than $300,000 has been drained from my accounts through forged signatures. Vanessa did not just push me toward those subway tracks. She has been bleeding my business dry for a long time. The most painful realization is that David knew. He saw my signatures being faked, and he chose to stay silent. 3 times in the past year, I gave him the chance to be honest about their family finances, and every time he hid behind that practice line, telling me that everything was fine and I should not worry so much. At the very bottom of the box lies a cream-colored envelope containing the draft of a trust fund I had planned to announce for my future grandchildren at the company's 30th anniversary. I had dreamed of children's laughter filling this house, of a new generation carrying on the Ellis name. Now, that letter just looks ridiculous. It is a monument to an unconditional love that was deeply betrayed. I do not even feel bad about the $300,000 anymore. I feel bad for the 30 years of my youth that I traded away to raise a conspirator. A coldness settles over me that has nothing to do with the air conditioning. It is the weight of a new determination. I close the wooden box, the dry thud echoing through the room like a declaration of war. No matter what happens next, I will not waste another second of my time on these ungrateful souls. For the first time, I am eating breakfast without the weight of David's latest office drama or Vanessa's subtle jabs hanging over me. This sense of freedom feels like taking a first deep breath after years of being underwater. I reach for my iPhone, and my thumb slides over the screen with a precision that surprises me. My fingers do not shake as I find the contact for Gerald Morrison, my longtime attorney. I am fully aware that the moment I press that call button, the pristine image of the Ellis family will begin to crack. The fortress I spent my life building to protect my son is about to be dismantled. But I understand now that it was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. A flicker of the old fear tries to rise, the fear of being alone at 62, the shame of admitting my own children were the ones who betrayed me. But I quickly stifle it. I remember the way the air felt as the train approached, and I remember the lack of hesitation in Vanessa's shove. "Gerald," I say when he finally answers, my voice as steady and cold as a frozen lake in upstate New York. "I need you to pull the papers for a complete restructuring of Ellis Healthcare. Everything. And Gerald, have your office draft an eviction notice for my residence as well. It is time for a long overdue cleaning of this house. Could you, like Elizabeth, find the courage to let go of family ties that only cause pain? Have you ever felt your sacrifices were taken for granted? Please share your story below. Your wisdom is a gift. It might be the very light someone else needs to find their own peace and truth today." After my call with Gerald, I do not rush to leave the apartment. I have learned over 3 decades in the boardroom, but in a struggle where your opponents share your own roof, haste is your greatest enemy. I need time. The very thing I once wasted on indulging my children must now become the instrument I use to observe them. I hear the familiar electronic chirp of the door code and the heavy click of the lock. David and Vanessa are home. I take a deep breath, consciously smoothing the sharp lines of a corporate chairwoman from my face. I replace them with the vacant, weary expression of a grandmother who has just barely escaped the grave. Vanessa walks in carrying a signature silver bag from Dean and DeLuca, a smile plastered on her face, but her eyes are restless, scanning the room to gauge exactly how much of me has returned from that ledge. She tells me she bought the asparagus soup I like, her voice so thick with artificial sweetness it makes my stomach turn. David stands a few paces behind her, refusing to meet my eyes, his hands nervously fiddling with his car keys. I take my seat at the dining table, making sure my hand trembles just enough as I pick up the silver spoon. I purposefully let it slip, watching it hit the floor with a sharp, piercing clang that echoes through the room. I whisper an apology, telling them I still feel dizzy after what happened at the station. Vanessa is at my side in an instant, her hand resting on my shoulder. I can feel the rigid coldness in her fingertips, a touch that feels more like a threat than a comfort. She tells me not to worry, that the doctor said the shock would make me feel a little confused or senile for a while. She suggests they should handle everything at the company so I can rest. A cold shiver runs down my spine at the word confused. It is not a consolation. It is a tactical move to strip me of my autonomy. I look at David, searching for even a flicker of regret, but he only mumbles that I should listen to Vanessa and take a real break. They are gaslighting me in my own home, using my age as a weapon to push me further into the shadows. That night, once David's heavy breathing and Vanessa's hushed whispers have faded into the silence of the guest wing, I begin my own search. I do not turn on the lamps. I rely only on the dim, ghostly glow of my iPhone screen. I slip into the study that Vanessa has quietly claimed as her own over the last few months. I find myself digging through the paper shredder and the waste bin, looking for the tiny scraps of paper most people would ignore. But 30 years of leading Ellis healthcare taught me how to find the story hidden within broken numbers. I find it. A transfer receipt from a small bank in Jersey. The name Med Supply Solutions appears again. This time, $50,000 was moved just 48 hours before my accident. My heart beats so hard, I fear it might burst through my ribs. They aren't just stealing my legacy. They are using my own hard-earned money to hire lawyers and prepare for a legal coup. My hands stop shaking. The fear is gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline fury that gives me more strength than I have felt in years. Early the next morning, I use the excuse of a walk in Central Park to meet Sandra Chen, my chief operating officer and my oldest friend. We sit on a wooden bench near Bethesda Terrace, surrounded by the morning joggers and the comforting smell of toasted bagels from a nearby cart. Sandra hands me a secure tablet, confirming my worst suspicions. Vanessa has been trying to bypass the payroll systems using David's credentials, attempting to create a financial deficit she can blame on my supposed lack of oversight. I look at the graphs on the screen and feel a strange, sharp clarity. I tell Sandra to begin the process of quietly detaching our core assets. We must make sure they don't notice a single ripple on the surface while we move the foundation beneath them. Sandra looks at me with a deep, somber empathy, asking if I am certain, knowing this will leave David with nothing. I look out toward the maple trees, turning a vivid, fiery red. David chose to stand by and watch me die. It is time I teach him how to live without the protection of the mother he betrayed. When I return home, I find Vanessa holding one of my antique porcelain vases, pretending to change the flowers. She looks at me with a hidden sense of triumph, claiming she was worried because I was gone so long. I give her a smile I practiced all morning. I tell her I just needed some fresh air, and that I realized how precious time really is. I tell her we should cherish every moment we have left together. She does not understand the weight behind my words. She thinks I am talking about the end of a frail old woman's life. But I am talking about the final moments she will spend living in the luxury bought by my sweat and tears. I walk toward my room, each step feeling more solid and certain than the last. My search for the truth is over. I have everything I need. What began as a journey to understand my betrayal has now become a quiet, unstoppable march toward justice. I left the wooden bench at Central Park, carrying the crisp, biting chill of a New York autumn and the shattering truths Sandra had just unveiled. Every step I took on the Manhattan pavement was no longer a simple stroll. It was the measured march of a soldier returning from a front line that no one else could see. I had seen the numbers on the screen, the cold digital evidence of a betrayal that went far deeper than a single push in a dark subway station. But as I stood before the door of my own apartment, I had to stop and take a deep, stabilizing breath to suppress the fury that was threatening to boil over. I turned the handle, and immediately, an oppressive atmosphere closed in around me. The space that had been my sanctuary for decades now reeked of artificial chamomile tea and the unwelcome presence of a stranger. In the living room, Vanessa was perched on the cream velvet armchair, looking every bit the concerned daughter-in-law. Beside her sat a middle-aged man in a sharp gray suit, holding a leather-bound portfolio with a clinical detachment that made my skin crawl. David was standing by the window, staring out at the rhythmic flow of traffic on Fifth Avenue, as if trying to lose himself in the gridlock. Vanessa looked up and offered a smile that felt colder than the steel tracks I had nearly died on. She stood and approached me, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet concern, as she introduced the man as Dr. Sterling, a specialist in psychological trauma. She claimed they were just so worried about me, mentioning how confused and forgetful I had seemed since the accident. I did not sit down. I stood there in the center of the room, still wrapped in my camel hair coat, my leather gloves still holding the late afternoon cold. I told them I didn't remember making an appointment with any doctor. My voice was calm, but it had a jagged, cutting edge to it. The man began to speak in a rehearsed, soothing tone about cognitive decline following a traumatic event and the immense risks of managing a massive corporation like Ellis Healthcare in an unstable mental state. Vanessa chimed in, leaning closer to me, suggesting that for my own sake, and for the sake of the legacy I built, I should sign a temporary agreement. She called it a way for David to handle the necessary paperwork, while I took a long, much-needed rest. Rest. The word echoed in my mind like a warning bell. I looked down at the document resting on the mahogany coffee table. It was a full power of attorney. If I put my name on that paper, I would officially become a ghost in the empire I had spent 30 years of my life building from nothing. A flash of pure, primal fear shot through me. The fear that I was truly alone, an aging woman fighting against the only family she had left. But then, a surge of heat began to rise from my chest, a fire fueled by decades of sacrifice that had been met with nothing but greed. I cut Dr. Sterling off in mid-sentence. I looked directly at Vanessa and asked her if she truly thought I was insane, or if she was just hoping that her shove at the station had actually managed to break my mind. David spun around at that, his face turning a sickly shade of white. Vanessa didn't even flinch. Her composure was terrifyingly absolute. She sighed and looked at the doctor, remarking on how I was hallucinating about the accident again. She looked at David and my son. The boy I had worked 3 jobs to support. The man I had paved every inch of a golden path for. Simply nodded, with a pathetic, weak submissiveness. He told me I wasn't well, and that I needed to listen to her. A dry, hollow laugh escaped my throat. I told David to look at me, to really look into my eyes. But he couldn't do it. I picked up the contract from the table. My hands were perfectly still. The tremor I had been faking earlier, now completely gone. I looked at Dr. Sterling and advised him to leave my home immediately before I called the corporate legal team to report an unauthorized and predatory medical assessment. Then I turned to Vanessa and David. I gripped the thick, expensive paper and tore it right down the middle. Then again, and again. The white fragments fluttered to the floor like dead, withered flower petals. I told them that as long as there was breath in my lungs, no one in this house would touch a single cent of Ellis healthcare without my explicit permission. Vanessa stood up abruptly, and the mask of the dutiful daughter-in-law finally cracked. Her eyes were dark with an unrestrained, ugly greed. She screamed at me, calling me a senile old woman who was past her prime. She threatened that if I wouldn't sign quietly, they would take me to court and prove I was no longer competent to handle my own affairs. I didn't back down. I stepped toward her, getting close enough to see the frantic pulse in her neck and the flicker of uncertainty in her pupils. I whispered for her to try it. I told her to see exactly who would be the one to disappear from Manhattan first. They left shortly after, taking their poison and their threats with them. When the door finally clicked shut, the silence that followed was as heavy as lead. I collapsed into the armchair, feeling a deep physical ache, as if I had just survived a literal fistfight. My heart felt tight and constricted when I thought about David. He had chosen to stand with a person trying to destroy me. That pain was sharper and more lasting than the impact of hitting the ground at the subway station. I sat there, in the gathering shadows of the sunset, watching the light fade over the city. I felt exhausted, like an old oak tree that had just weathered a Category 5 hurricane. My branches were broken, and my leaves were gone, but my roots were still buried deep in the earth. I picked up my phone, my thumb hovering over old photos of David as a toddler, before I decisively turned off the screen. The time for being soft was over. I couldn't change the past 30 years of overindulgence, but I could certainly protect the years I had left. I called Gerald. I told him they had made their move. I told him it was time for us to take the next step. I wanted them to see that a mother who could build everything from nothing was more than capable of taking it all back. My voice was no longer shaking. In the wreckage of my family, I had found a cold, immovable resilience I never knew I possessed. After the shredded pieces of that power of attorney contract hit the floor, I felt a strange and profound stillness settle over the room. Vanessa's screams were still echoing in the hallway, but they no longer made me tremble. Instead, they sounded like wind rattling a loose window pane. Noisy, yes, but ultimately harmless, if you know how to lock the door tight. You see, in business and in life, when your opponent loses their composure and resorts to pure aggression, that is exactly when they are at their weakest. I stood up with a calm I hadn't felt in years, gathered those scraps of paper, and dropped them into the fireplace. I watched the orange flames consume the final remnants of their betrayal, turning their greed into nothing but gray ash. The next morning, I woke up not with a heavy heart, but with a precise list of objectives. This wasn't about seeking a petty revenge. It was about protecting the empire I had spent 30 years of my life building from the ground up. I drove my Tesla through the morning bustle of Midtown Manhattan to the offices of Gerald Morrison. Gerald greeted me with a hot cup of Starbucks and a fixed stack of folders. But we didn't waste time talking about the pain of the situation. We talked about data. I instructed him to begin a full estate restructuring immediately. For years, I had focused on paving a golden path for David. But I realized now that I had accidentally built a wide-open highway for a predator to enter my life. We began the process of establishing an irrevocable trust. This legal fortress would ensure that all the assets of Ellis Healthcare Group were shielded from any individual interference, including my own son's, unless approved by an independent board of directors. Gerald looked at me over the rim of his glasses and nodded with a newfound respect, telling me that I was doing exactly what was necessary to save my legacy before it was too late. The next phase required a deep dive with a forensic accounting team. Sandra Chen and I spent hours in a glass-walled conference room, meticulously reviewing every invoice and every wire transfer linked to that shell company, Med Supply Solutions. We discovered that the $300,000 I had found earlier was just the beginning. The actual theft was far more extensive, hidden within clever, small-scale expenses over the course of nearly 2 years. Rather than making a scene at home, I quietly ordered the freezing of all secondary accounts that David and Vanessa had joint access to. I updated my digital signatures and implemented multi-factor authentication that only Sandra and I controlled. Watching those financial loopholes close one by one brought a sense of peace I didn't know I had lost. I finally understood that generosity without boundaries is simply a breeding ground for greed. When I returned to my Fifth Avenue apartment, I no longer saw it as a gilded trap. I brought in a specialized security team to replace every smart lock in the residence and install discrete cameras in the hallways, especially leading to my private study. I also made the difficult but necessary decision to hire a new housekeeping service through a high-end agency in the city. People who had absolutely no connection to Vanessa or her web of influence. I wanted every corner of this home to be under my undisputed control again. That afternoon, I spent time in the kitchen alone, preparing a simple dinner of grilled salmon and asparagus. As I sat at the table in the quiet of the evening, I didn't feel lonely. I felt free. Vanessa's presence in my home began to fade with every small, deliberate change I made. My private investigator, a man named Mark with 2 decades of experience in the police force, delivered a background report on Vanessa that changed everything for me. Reading through it, a chill ran down my spine. But it also released me from the crushing weight of self-blame. Vanessa didn't just wake up one day and decide to be cruel. She had a prior record for financial fraud in another state under a different name. A past that David had either never known about or had purposefully hidden from me. Seeing those facts on paper made me realize that the tragedy at the subway station wasn't a result of me being a bad mother or a failure. It was the nature of a predator who had found an easy target in a woman who was too trusting of her own family. This truth was the final piece of the puzzle I needed to fully fortify my own spirit. For the rest of the week, I practiced what I call active silence. I still lived under the same roof as them, but I stopped arguing and I stopped explaining myself. When Vanessa tried to approach me with a hollow apology, or when David tried to bring up company business, I simply offered a polite, distant smile and told them I was busy and that we would speak later. My silence made them panic. They quickly realized their credit cards were no longer working, their access to corporate systems had been revoked, and the mother they thought they could manipulate was gone. I observed their frustration from a distance, like someone watching a storm safely from behind a thick glass wall. I was focusing all my energy on the most important step of all, legally removing the title of heir from the people who had proven they were unworthy of it. Tonight, I am standing on my balcony, looking down at the restless lights of Manhattan. The autumn air is cold, but I feel a warmth deep in my chest that has nothing to do with the heater. My defensive system is complete. My legacy is now locked tight within ironclad legal clauses that no amount of greed can break. I am no longer afraid of a shove in the dark, because I have finally learned how to stand firm on my own 2 feet. The regret I felt for the years I wasted is slowly being replaced by a quiet pride in the strength I have found in the present. I know there are more difficult confrontations ahead, but I am ready for them. I am no longer just a mother being taken advantage of. I am Elizabeth Ellis, and I have officially taken back the lead in my own life story. After those long, grueling days buried under cold contracts and mounting legal data, I found myself craving something real, something human. My home was technically safe now, protected by new locks and high-tech cameras, but my soul was still nursing the raw, jagged wounds from that night at the subway station. I realized I could not just live the rest of my life hidden behind a fortress of my own making. So, this afternoon, I left Fifth Avenue behind and drove down to a small, sun-drenched bistro in Chelsea. It is a quiet place where Sandra Chen and I have retreated for over 20 years, every time the corporate world tried to swallow us whole. Sandra was already there, waiting at her usual table in the corner, near a window that looks out onto the bustling New York street. The moment she saw me, she did not ask about the lawyers or the forensic audit. She simply stood up and wrapped her arms around me in a tight, unwavering hug. She smelled of white tea and old books, a scent of absolute reliability. "Elizabeth, you have lost weight," she whispered into my shoulder. We ordered 2 bowls of French onion soup and shared a bottle of crisp white wine. In the warmth of that bistro, surrounded by the low hum of jazz and the soft amber glow of the lamps, I felt the icy walls I had built around my heart finally begin to thaw. Sandra reached across the table and took my hand, her grip warm and steady, offering me a sense of peace that had been missing from my own home for far too long. "I am so full of regret, Sandra," I sighed, watching the condensation bead on my wine glass. I told her how it felt to realize I had spent 30 years pouring everything into a family that ultimately wanted me dead. Sandra looked me directly in the eyes, her voice gentle but forged from steel. She told me not to look at it as 30 wasted years. She reframed everything, telling me those 3 decades were proof that I had lived my life to the fullest as a mother. The betrayal was their failure, she said, not mine. She reminded me that I had built an empire that saved thousands of lives, and that was my true legacy. She told me it was time to spend the rest of my years on the woman named Elizabeth, not on the mother of children who did not deserve her. Her words felt like a spotlight cutting through the dark corners of my mind. I had not lost everything. I still had my dignity, my loyal friends, and a whole life ahead of me where I could finally learn to love myself. In times of despair, have you found a friend's kindness more healing than any medicine? Is there a Sandra in your life who stood by you when family wouldn't? Please share your story below. Your hard-earned wisdom could be the very strength someone else needs to feel seen and valued again. I left the bistro with the warmth of Sandra's hug still lingering on my shoulders. Her words had been like a much-needed sedative, helping me find the clarity to step back into the shadows of Manhattan. You know, Sometimes we think we have already tasted the full measure of bitterness that life has to offer. But the world always seems to find a way to throw a handful of salt into an open wound. Just as I stepped into the lobby of my building, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an email from Mark, the private investigator I had hired. The subject line was just 3 words that made my stomach drop. New evidence attached. I didn't even wait to get upstairs to my apartment. I pulled my car into a quiet, deserted corner of a side street and opened the file with a heart that was beating so fast it actually hurt. The screen of my phone lit up with a scanned document from the life insurance company my family had been with for decades. My eyes locked onto a specific line underlined in heavy red ink. Supplemental clause for accidental death. Only 3 months ago, the payout for my accidental death had been quietly raised to $5 million. But the thing that truly made me go numb, the thing that made the breath catch in my throat until I felt like I was choking, was the signature in the beneficiary and witness section. It wasn't just Vanessa. Right there, in that familiar slanted handwriting I had seen on 1,000 school reports and birthday cards, was David's signature. My son had signed off on this change on the very same day that Vanessa had bought me that expensive shampoo as a supposed gift. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, thick and bitter. It turned out that the shove at the subway station wasn't just a moment of greedy impulse from a manipulative daughter-in-law. It was a meticulously calculated business plan, where the mother's life was simply the commodity that yielded the highest profit. David hadn't just stood by and watched. He had prepared the bag to catch the insurance money before I had even hit the ground. I stared at the image of his signature, feeling 30 years of motherhood officially turned to ash in a single heartbeat. Every sacrifice I had made, every late night at the office, every hurdle I had cleared for him, felt like a joke. I returned home with a calm that was honestly terrifying, even to myself. I found Vanessa in my study, likely thinking I was still out wandering the city with Sandra. When I pushed the door open, she jumped, her hands flying to her laptop as she tried to close it. She couldn't hide the sheer panic in her eyes, though she tried to play it off by claiming she was just tidying up some of my old invoices. I walked toward her slowly and placed my phone face up on the mahogany desk. The screen was still glowing with the image of that insurance policy. I asked her if she was really tidying invoices, or if she was just checking to see how much longer it would take for that $5 million check to arrive. The air in the room seemed to freeze solid. Vanessa's face went deathly pale, and her lips trembled, but no words came out. At that exact moment, David walked into the room. When he saw the screen of my phone, his expression shifted from a startled white to a sickly, ashen gray. He reached out a hand toward me, as if he could somehow explain away the unexplainable. He tried to tell me it wasn't what it looked like, that they were just trying to ensure the family's financial security in case something happened. "Family," I whispered, cutting him off with a voice that was as cold as a New York winter. "What kind of family requires the mother to be dead for the children to be rich?" "David, did you really sign your own mother's death warrant for a pile of paper?" David collapsed into the velvet armchair, burying his face in his hands, unable to meet my gaze. But Vanessa, after the initial shock wore off, suddenly turned defiant. She let out a sharp, venomous laugh that filled the room. She asked me what I thought I was going to do about it. She claimed no one would believe an old, senile woman who had just survived a traumatic accident and was now hallucinating about insurance plots. She reminded me that David had signed it and that everything was perfectly legal on paper. She told me there was nothing I could do. Looking at her blatant arrogance and my son's pathetic weakness, I suddenly realized something vital. This was the opportunity I had been waiting for. Their overconfidence was their greatest flaw. They assumed that because the signatures were there, the game was over. They forgot that I am still the chairwoman of a major healthcare corporation, and I understand the legalities of mental capacity and predatory influence better than they ever could. The pain I had been carrying suddenly evaporated, replaced by an absolute diamond-sharp clarity. I picked up my phone and looked at the two people in front of me as if they were nothing more than a failed experiment. I told them they were right, that everything did need to be settled legally. I told them to believe me when I said that the laws in New York are very fair to those who actually know how to use them. I turned my back and walked out of the room, leaving them standing there in the beginning stages of a very real panic. The truth was out, and I realized I had nothing left to lose and no more regrets to carry. I had the evidence, I had my allies, and most importantly, I finally had myself back. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next blow. I was the architect of the justice that was about to come for them. After I stepped out of the study, leaving behind Vanessa's shameless arrogance and the sight of David's slumped, broken figure, I did not head for the master bedroom. Instead, my feet found their own way to the attic, the place where I have kept the most precious memories sealed away for 10 years, since my husband Marcus passed away. That blood-soaked insurance contract served as a brutal reminder that I had been so consumed with building a material empire that I had forgotten to guard its very soul. In the dim shadows of the attic, the scent of old wood and dried lavender drifted through the air, leading me back to a time when money was nothing more than hollow numbers compared to the warmth of true sincerity. I sat down on the hardwood floor, my hands trembling as I opened an old rusted tin box with a faded American flag on the lid. Inside lay Marcus's first stethoscope and the photo we took on the opening day of our first small clinic in Harlem back in 1995. Marcus was looking into the lens with eyes full of hope, his hand gripping mine tightly. "Elizabeth?" I could almost hear his deep, warm voice echoing in my mind. "We are doing this for the community, for the people who have no voice. Never let the dollar cloud your judgment." I touched the glass over the photo, and warm tears finally began to roll down my cheeks. Marcus had spent his life trying to teach David about honesty, about the pride of being an Ellis man. I realized now, with a sharp pang of regret, that after he died, I used wealth to fill the void of his absence, and in doing so, I accidentally robbed my son of the strength to resist temptation. I was not crying out of fear. I was crying because I felt I had failed Marcus. David's betrayal was not just aimed at me. It was aimed at everything Marcus believed in. In the absolute silence of this space, I no longer felt like a powerful chairwoman, nor did I feel like a pitiable victim. I saw myself as the last protector of the Ellis legacy. A strange sense of peace began to spread through me, as if Marcus were sitting right there beside me, placing his hand on my shoulder and breathing strength back into my spirit. The regret for the time that had passed no longer made me crumble. It transformed into a cold blue flame, lighting the path I had to take. I will not let Vanessa turn the name Ellis Healthcare into a place for money laundering or a way to profit from the dead. I will save David from this mire, even if the price is the ultimate pain of pushing him out of the comfort I built for him. I stood up, wiped away my tears, and clutched Marcus's stethoscope like a holy relic. "Thank you, Marcus," I whispered into the empty air. I know exactly what I have to do now. As I walked back down the stairs, every footstep carried the unwavering resolve of a woman who had finally found her way home to her roots. I stepped down from the attic, my palms still feeling the cold, clinical steel of Marcus's old stethoscope. The memories of our happy family days in Harlem felt as though they had happened only yesterday. Yet the reality was this luxury Manhattan apartment currently suffocating under a stench of betrayal. I found David sitting at the kitchen bar, a glass of cheap bourbon in front of him, the specific brand he only pours when he feels backed into a corner. The crystal chandelier above him cast a pale, sickly Sang over his tired and weak face. This was not a fight anymore. It was a soul-deep surgery I was forced to perform to cut out the final necrotic piece of my trust. I did not turn on any more lights. I walked closer and poured myself a glass of water, the ice cubes clinking against the glass with a dry, hollow sound that seemed to echo in the vastness of the kitchen. David did not look up. He remained fixed, staring at the grain of the wood on the counter. "Where's Vanessa?" I asked, my voice low and unnervingly still. "She's asleep. She's a bit tired," David mumbled, his voice sounding thin and hoarse. I sat in the chair directly opposite him, forcing him to acknowledge my presence. "David, do you remember that summer when you were 12? We went to Martha's Vineyard. You promised your father you would always be the man to protect this family." He stiffened, his shoulders trembling slightly. For a fleeting second, a flicker of nostalgia crossed his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a heavy defensive gloom. "Mom, that was 20 years ago. Everything is different now. Life in New York, the corporation, the pressure from Vanessa. You just don't understand." "I don't understand?" I felt a slow, simmering anger beginning to burn deep within. "I don't understand you signing a $5 million insurance policy right before I was pushed onto the tracks? I don't understand you standing by while your wife tried to kill your mother without saying a word? Or do I simply not understand you calling that cruel, calculated greed pressure?" David finally looked up, his face flushed from the alcohol and a desperate, blind defensiveness. "Vanessa only wanted what was best for our future. You're clinging to that chairwoman's seat. You won't let go so we can breathe. She said if anything happened to you, at least we would have some security." "Security bought with your mother's life, David?" I asked, each word falling between us like a hammer strike. "How much time have you wasted lying to yourself that Vanessa is the victim? You've let her manipulate you to the point where you see your own mother as nothing more than an insurance debt? I spent 30 years paving the road for you, David, but I realize now I was only paving a path for someone without a backbone." David slammed his glass onto the table, the bourbon splashing across the polished wood. "You're always right. You're always the hero. And me? I'm just a shadow of you and Dad. Vanessa at least makes me feel like I'm the master of my own life." I looked at him and felt a wave of profound helplessness wash over me. This was the most painful violation of all, not the theft of my property, but the desecration of the very love I had nurtured for 3 decades. He was using his own self-inflicted wounds to justify his complicity in a crime against his own blood. I realized then that the son I loved had died long ago, replaced by a stranger with a soul full of petty envy and small-minded resentment. "Master of your own life?" I laughed dryly, the sound echoing harshly in the dark. "A master who has to sneak around in the dark and sign for his mother's death? David, you didn't just betray me. You betrayed the very name Ellis that your father kept with his honor. I stood up, my anger transforming into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. I didn't feel sad anymore. I only felt an absolute piercing clarity. David, this conversation was the last chance I was giving you. Not for an apology, because an apology cannot fix this, but to see if you had a single shred of humanity left. But I have my answer. He looked at me, a sudden flash of fear finally igniting in his eyes. What are you going to do? I'm going to do what the chairwoman of Ellis Healthcare and the wife of Marcus Ellis has to do, I said, my voice echoing through the dark, silent kitchen with a weight that seemed to shake the walls. I am going to protect our legacy from this rot. From this moment on, you and Vanessa are no longer part of my future plans. I will not let you waste one more second of my time on your filthy schemes. I turned my back and walked away, my footsteps firm, steady, and decisive on the hardwood. David called out after me, his voice finally choking up with the weight of what he had lost. But I did not look back. I felt like I had just dropped a 1,000-pound weight that I had been carrying for far too long. The time for indulgence and motherly protection was over. Now there was only the cold requirement of justice and the truth. Is there any pain greater than realizing the child you gave birth to is an accomplice in a plot to harm you? In Elizabeth's situation, if the son still makes excuses for his wife's wrongs, would you choose to forgive or cut ties to protect yourself? Share your thoughts with me in the comments below. The night in New York passed in a silence that was almost terrifying after that final hollow confrontation with David at the kitchen bar. The next morning, I woke up while the city was still submerged in a thick gray fog rolling off the Hudson River. You know, the most profound pain does not come from the moment you are attacked, but from the realization that you must now gather weapons against the very people you once considered your entire world. I stood by the window of my Fifth Avenue apartment, looking down at the restless flow of traffic, my fingers absent-mindedly turning the wedding ring Marcus had given me so many years ago. Last night's conversation had severed the final fraying cord of my connection to my son. Now, there was no more room in my mind for the tears of regret. I needed the cold, sharp clarity of a soldier preparing for the front lines. I spent the entire morning in the Midtown office of Gerald Morrison. The atmosphere in his private suite was heavy with the scent of fresh paper and expensive archival ink. Gerald pushed a deep blue leather folder toward me across his mahogany desk. "Elizabeth, everything is in place," he said, his voice dropping to a somber, professional tone. He explained that the new codicil to my will had been notarized and the update to the corporate bylaws was final. Every single one of my shares in Ellis Healthcare had been officially transferred into an irrevocable trust. This meant the assets were now shielded by an independent board, protected from any personal interference or predatory claims. Then, he pulled out a crisp white envelope. "This is the formal eviction notice for David and Vanessa," he added. "It is legally binding and will take effect the moment you announce your decisions at the board of directors meeting tomorrow." I turned each page slowly, reading every clause with a meticulous eye. Every word and every comma carried the heavy weight of a necessary judgment. I had made the decision to leave them with nothing but the hollow shell of the old holding company, along with the massive debts Vanessa had surreptitiously created through her embezzlement and fraud. This was not an act of petty revenge. It was an act of total restoration. They hungered for money, so I would show them how that same money could become an iron cage when it was not earned through honesty. Gerald looked at me with a touch of concern, asking if I was truly certain I wanted to do this in such a public forum. I nodded, my eyes as cold as the glass towers outside his window. I told him they had pushed me onto the subway tracks in front of a platform full of strangers, so it was only right that justice be served in front of everyone they knew. When I returned home, I stepped into a theater of forced silence. Vanessa and David seemed to be actively avoiding me now, hiding away in their wing of the apartment. I could hear their muffled whispers through the walls, likely spinning new webs and schemes they believed I was still too senile to notice. I sat alone in the vast, formal dining room, enjoying a perfectly seared steak and a glass of deep red Cabernet from Napa Valley. This luxury, this home, every single brick and piece of art was built by my own hands and Marcus's vision. I looked up at the Howard Miller clock on the wall, its steady, rhythmic ticking sounding like a countdown to the end of their time in this sanctuary. I realized in that moment that I no longer felt a burning disgust for them. The anger had transformed into a strange, clinical distance. I watched Vanessa as she scurried across the living room to grab a bottle of water, her arrogant posture still intact. She still truly believed that the $5 million insurance policy was her golden ticket to a paradise of my making. She had no idea that my investigator, Mark, had already turned over every shred of evidence regarding the Ford signatures and the shell company transfers to the FBI. I was simply waiting now, a focused and patient observer. Every minute that ticked by was another brick I was laying in the wall that would forever separate them from a life of stolen wealth. On this final night before the board meeting, I sat in my study, reviewing the digital files one last time. I watched the grainy security footage Mark had recovered from the subway station. The image of Vanessa's aggressive shove and David's paralyzed, silent stance played out in the shadows of the screen. I turned the monitor off. My heart was racing slightly, with a quiet, focused excitement. But it was not the heart of a victim. It was the heart of an architect finishing her most difficult work of justice. I placed the copy of the eviction notice and the trust documents into my leather briefcase. Tomorrow, when the sun rises over the Manhattan skyline, the world David and Vanessa have built out of lies will collapse. I wasted 30 years of my life sheltering a weak son, but I will not lose another second of my time protecting anything but the truth. I went to bed with a profound, quiet peace. The time for regret had finally ended. The time for the final judgment had begun. This morning, Manhattan was wrapped in a cold gray blanket of early winter, the kind of day where the wind bites through even the thickest wool. I stood before the full-length mirror in my dressing room, carefully tying the vintage Hermes silk scarf around my neck. It was a gift from Marcus on the 20th anniversary of the corporation, a piece of our shared history that felt more like armor than an accessory. Looking at my reflection, I no longer saw the fragile, shaken woman who had been shoved toward the darkness of the subway tracks. I saw a woman who had finally gathered the broken pieces of her life and forged them into something unbreakable. The leather briefcase in my hand felt heavy, weighted with the absolute proof of betrayal and the ironclad legal documents that would set me free. I wasn't heading to the office for a confrontation. I was going there to put the world back in its proper order. As I stepped into the lobby of Ellis Healthcare, the rhythmic click of my heels on the white marble floor sounded like the steady, purposeful strike of a gavel, announcing that the time for games was officially over. The boardroom on the 45th floor seemed to hang in the clouds, overlooking the jagged skyline of the city we had helped build. Vanessa was already seated, draped in an expensive Chanel suit, her face glowing with a triumphant light as if she were about to be crowned queen of the empire. David sat beside her, still carrying that familiar, gloomy air of defeat. Yet I could see a flickering, greedy expectation in his eyes. When I walked into the room, the hushed conversations among the board members died down instantly, leaving a silence so thick you could hear the hum of the ventilation system. I took my place at the head of the long mahogany table, moving with a deliberate, unhurried grace as I laid my briefcase down. I thanked everyone for being there, my voice resonating with a quiet authority that seemed to startle my son. I told them I had two major announcements regarding the future of the Ellis Healthcare Group. Vanessa offered me a small, practiced smile and nudged David's elbow under the table. She clearly believed I was about to announce my retirement and hand over the keys to the kingdom, just as she had planned. But that smile vanished the moment I slid the first set of folders toward the board members. I looked Vanessa directly in the eyes as I made the first announcement. I explained that the corporation was undergoing a total structural reorganization. Every core asset, every medical patent, and every operational contract had already been transferred to a new legal entity, controlled entirely by the Ellis Irrevocable Trust. The company they currently sat in, the one where Vanessa and David held their titles and minor shares, was now nothing more than an empty shell, saddled with the massive credit debts and liabilities Vanessa had created through her various fraudulent schemes. Vanessa bolted upright, her face turning a sickly mottled white, as she demanded to know what I was talking about. David began to stutter, his voice high and thin, asking how I could do this to them. I didn't give them a chance to spiral into their rehearsed excuses. I simply activated the large monitor behind me. The grainy, high-contrast footage from the subway station filled the room, playing in a loop that no one could look away from. The image of Vanessa's aggressive shove and David's frozen, complicit silence was displayed in haunting clarity before the stunned members of the board. The room became a tomb. I continued, my voice as cold and steady as a New York winter, announcing that the full evidence of the attempted murder and the $5 million insurance fraud had already been delivered to the district attorney's office and the FBI. I told them the authorities were already waiting in the lobby downstairs. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Vanessa's ragged, panicked breathing. She began to scream, her voice a shrill, desperate cacophony, as she accused me of being senile and delusional. But when the federal agent stepped into the boardroom, her legs finally gave out, and she collapsed into her chair. David looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization and a plea for a mercy he hadn't earned. He begged me to save him, crying out that he didn't want to go to prison. I looked at the boy I had loved more than my own life, and my heart ached with a profound, final sorrow. But it was the necessary pain of an amputation, the kind required to save the rest of a dying body. I told him that I had been saving him for 30 years by shielding him with my wealth, only to have him turn into a man who could watch his mother be killed for a check. I told him that today, I was saving him by letting him finally face the consequences of his own choices. It was the last and most important lesson a mother could ever teach her son. Once the police had led Vanessa away, and David followed behind his lawyer with his head bowed in shame, I stood alone in the vast, empty boardroom. The chaos had evaporated, leaving behind a sense of peace that was almost physical. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out toward the Hudson River, which was sparkling like crushed diamonds under the pale winter sun. The satisfaction I felt didn't come from seeing them punished. It came from the knowledge that I had protected the honor of the Ellis name. I had guarded the legacy that Marcus and I had poured our blood, sweat, and tears into for decades. I took out my phone and called Sandra, telling her simply that it was over and that I was coming home. I walked out of the building and into the crisp afternoon air, no longer needing an escort or the hollow prestige of my title to feel important. The New York wind swept past me, and I took a long, deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs with a sweetness I hadn't noticed in years. The era of betrayal was closed. I had finally reunited with the strong, resilient woman I had nearly lost in the shadows of my own kindness. I felt light, as if a golden cage that had been holding me for half a lifetime had finally been dismantled. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a very long time, I found that I was truly, deeply at peace. And so, the story of Elizabeth Ellis comes to its final chapter. You know, as I share these last few words about Elizabeth, walking out of that corporate building with her head held high, I find myself feeling an incredible sense of relief. New York is still its usual self, bustling and biting with the winter chill. But inside that 62-year-old woman, a new spring has truly begun. The greatest lesson Elizabeth leaves us with is perhaps the most difficult one to accept, and that is the courage to cut away the parts of our lives that have turned toxic, even when those parts are made of our own flesh and blood. Family is more than just a biological connection or a shared last name. Real family is made of the people who truly cherish your existence and respect your soul. People like Sandra and Gerald are what we call a chosen family, the ones who stood by her in her darkest hour without asking for a thing in return. Never let your kindness and your sacrifices become a springboard for someone else's greed. Please remember that you deserve to be loved and valued for exactly who you are, not for the empire you built or the things you possess. Elizabeth's journey has reached its end, but I believe it has opened up so many deep reflections for all of us today. How do you feel about Elizabeth's final decision regarding her son? Do you think that kind of firm, unwavering boundary was the only way for her to truly find her peace? I want to hear your thoughts and the lessons you have taken away from this journey. Please share your perspective in the comments below, because I truly value your heart and your voice. This is Casey, saying goodbye for now, and I look forward to walking alongside you on our next journey together.